Stage is Angela Boyce. She's a business professional, former athlete, and CBD store owner who has broken into the industry at just age 21. She's gonna be talking about CBD in the sports industry, focused on the psychological side of the industry. So give it up for Angela Boyce.
Hello everyone, I'm Angela Boyce. Happy to be here, so thank you to the USA CBD Expo for hosting this amazing event. Okay, so do I have any athletes in the crowd? Yeah? Great. Okay, so I'm here to talk about CBD and sports performance today. So specifically, I'm talking about CBD and how it can help manage stress-induced health conditions that inhibit performance. So first, a little bit about myself. I'm a store owner of Primo Gardens, Inc. in Columbus. We're a manufacturing facility. We have a retail space and lab. We do private labeling, white labeling, etc. I graduated from the University of Akron with a background in psychology and research methods of social sciences. And I also competed as an athlete. I was a women's soccer player, so I played Division I, competing in the MAC. So let's get into this. So it's pretty hard to get to the elite level as an athlete. So here are some probabilities just to show you how hard it really is. Only 7.3% of high school football players go on to play in the NCAA, and only 2.9% go on to play Division I. And for women's soccer, 7.2% of high school participants go on to play in the NCAA, and only 2.4% go on to play Division I. So those are some comparable stats. It's even more difficult to get to the next level after that, which is professional. So only 1.6% of all football athletes in the NCAA go on to play in the NFL. So a better stat to look at would be that 3.8% of draft-eligible Division I athletes get drafted into the NFL. So pretty small percent. And of all of the NCAA picks into the NFL, 77.6% come from conferences with autonomous governance. So that's the ACC, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12, SEC. But even coming from those leagues, the chances are still pretty low. It's 11%. So overall, 0.03% of high school football participants go on to play in the NFL. And how do you get in that top 0.03%? Is performance. So performance is very important for athletes, and we measure this with metrics called KPIs, which are key performance indicators, and these are quantifiable measures used to evaluate the success of meeting an objective. So sports have always been recognized as a great environment for testing for performance because it's a controlled setting with high pressure, multiple participants, and participants who carry out objectives. So, of course, there's indicators like speed, strength, agility, endurance. You've got that repeated sprint ability. You've got maximum aerobic capacity. But all of these indicators fall short of evaluating the full picture. So, two indicators that impact performance greatly are injury prevention and recovery and psychological performance. So injury prevention and recovery is important because if you're physically unable to compete, you're unable to perform. So it's important to take the proper precautions to prevent and recover from injury. For psychological performance, it's important because at the elite level, every good athlete has good KPIs. But what separates a great athlete versus a good athlete is psychological performance. So we measure these with KBIs, which are key behavioral indicators. And some examples of this could be motivation, focus, sports IQ. But one KPI that is gaining a lot of attention is mental health. Right, so it's pretty prevalent. And it's considered an athlete health concern, both injury prevention and recovery and psychological health or illness. And we know of some big name athletes who have stepped up to talk about this. We've got Naomi Osaka, Michael Phelps, Kevin Love, Simone Biles, to really expose these extreme conditions. But the reality of this is that this is nothing new. Athletes have been suffering in silence for decades, and there just hasn't been the awareness and receptivity to these stories. Many people write off athletes, and celebrities for that matter, and write off their mental health conditions because they have been successful, so what is there to be depressed about? But the thing about mental illness is that it doesn't discriminate on who it affects. Rich, poor, successful, or not, mental illness can be a serious threat to anyone. So some more stats. We've got 33% of all college students experience mental health conditions, with 30% of them going to seek help. But for college athletes, only 10% seek help. So that means that 90% of mental health conditions go unaddressed. So depression severity is higher in current college athletes, but prevalence is higher in retired athletes. So this is both a current issue and once you stop playing that sport as well. So it has also been found in a recent study by the NCAA that 1 in 10, so 10%, of college athletes reported that they constantly or every day feel so depressed that it is difficult to function. Right. So also in another survey, a survey of college athletes, 69.7% of college athletes have experienced a mental illness, and more than half of college athletes said that they have depression, anxiety, or an eating disorder, but are too scared to tell anyone or see a doctor. So what does that tell you about the environment? And keep in mind, this is a survey, so it's self-report, but this is the perspective of the athlete. So there's that stat. So, how is mental illness preventing athletes from competing and performing? This is where I'm really going to dive into the psychological factors that contribute to it and what it looks like for the athlete. A lot of these mechanisms are very prevalent in performance training, so what they go in to do every day. So we know that the training environment is high pressure and high stress, and we know that the athlete is pushed to the limit and sometimes even past the limit just so they perform. It's task after task after task, a fitness test or two, and then some more tasks. So what does this do to the athlete, and what does it do over time? For us to understand the impact, we must understand the response. So we've got the stress response. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this, and even if you haven't heard of it, you probably experience it pretty frequently. So the stress response is very common in daily life. It's used to detect and avoid danger. Your stress response reacts faster than your brain can consciously think. So essentially, it's the impulse reaction that saves you from danger. And you have different communication systems in your body, like your nervous system and your endocrine system, which communicate so that you can carry out the stress response. So one structure, the amygdala, is a region in your brain, and that's what senses the danger and signals this response. But one key part that I want you to recognize here is the HPA axis, and that'll come into play when we talk about CBD. So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and that is what activates the increase of cortisol. So it sends a few different hormones to different regions in your system, and eventually it releases that cortisol into your bloodstream. So But then after the perceived danger subsides, cortisol levels drop, and the parasympathetic nervous system activates to deactivate that stress response. So cortisol and performance. High levels of cortisol over a prolonged period of time contributes to chronic stress. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that. But what does that have to do? What does that have to do with the athlete? So cortisol's impact on injury prevention and recovery. High levels of cortisol reduce the production of cytokines, which play a huge role in repairing tissue. High levels of stress and cortisol can also lead to weight gain, insomnia, tissue breakdown, a suppressed immune system, tissue inflammation, and hormone imbalances, all of which are not great for recovery. Now, how does this play into psychological health? Well, cortisol concentration increase over time with persistent high-intensity training without proper rest and recovery. Does that sound familiar? That's performance training. Persistent high-intensity training without proper rest and recovery. So cortisol can also contribute to hormone imbalances, which can lead to depressive episodes and stress-induced depression. So essentially, the dysregulation of that HPA, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, that contributes to cortisol hyperactivity, which limits the amount of serotonin that your body produces. So high levels of cortisol over a prolonged period of time contributes to chronic stress, and chronic stress can potentially lead to stress-induced anxiety and depression. And that's where it plays into performance. That's a performance inhibitor. So we've got amygdala hyperactivity. So high levels of cortisol increase activity in the amygdala, which increases the number of connections and strengthens those pathways. It also weakens the HPA axis and other healthy pathways. So it strengthens those unhealthy pathways and weakens the healthy ones. So specifically, we're talking about the VCA1 and PBLA, and those are regions in your brain. Those are the healthy regions in your brain that manage that stress. So essentially, a weakened HPA amplifies the stress, whereas the VCA1 and PBLA manage that stress. So with performance training and chronic stress, the healthy pathways weaken and the unhealthy pathways strengthen. The adverse impact of this, so persistent stress response activation, also known as chronic stress, that can contribute to amygdala hyperactivity, neuronal damage, brain mass shrinkage, and a number of memory problems. It also contributes to altered gene expression and synaptic plasticity, which plays into concussions, that plasticity. So now let's talk about CBD and how that can play a role here. So first let's talk about, is it legal for an athlete to use CBD? The World Anti-Doping Agency removed CBD from the prohibited substance list, and over 200 anti-doping organizations, including the MLS and the PGA, have adopted the same policy. However, the NCAA and NBA have not. So CBD, a cannabinoid found in the cannabis plant, known for its balancing effects, it interacts with the CB1 and CB2 receptors in the endocannabinoid system, which is another system that communicates in your body. It communicates with other systems, such as the nervous system, and therefore the endocrine system. And how exactly does that play a role in performance? Essentially, CBD it alleviates the impact of stressors and reduces the potential for stress-induced anxiety and depression, those performance inhibitors. So CBD administration has been found to reverse damage caused by chronic stressors, and more importantly, alleviate depressive-like symptoms. And specifically, it strengthens those healthy pathways that regulate the response. So that VCA1, that becomes more excited. Those neurons activate more, and those PBLA connections. And those are the healthy pathways. And the HPA axis, which, as we talked about before, which is weakened by that stress response, that gets strengthened. CBD actually strengthens that access point. So it promotes those healthy pathways. So this is kind of how it works. So in conclusion, we know that athletes experience a lot of stress, and we know that that stress contributes to chronic illnesses like stress-induced depression and anxiety. So CBD has been found to really alleviate some of those symptoms. So how can we incorporate this into the sports industry? It has to be more accepted. We have to recognize these stories and recognize these problems that we have in the industry. So I know I kind of covered it pretty fast, so you can pull up the full article here, and this has all of the references as well. Strongly recommend you look at a lot of those articles. It's the science behind it. And I know we're kind of short on time, but does anyone have any questions? Okay. I'll be over to the side as well if you come up with any questions afterwards. But thank you so much for listening in, and I appreciate you guys attending.